Real quick before we start, I want to thank Mason Weeb and Nick Myers for becoming our newest Patreon supporters. As you've heard me say many times at the beginning of this podcast, Patreon is the financial foundation of all things Mountain and Prairie. So if you like Mountain and Prairie, you can go to mountainandprairie.com/support and look at the very long list of people who have generously supported the podcast over the years. And you can thank them, because without them and their support, this thing would not be happening. So I just really appreciate Mason and Nick signing up, as well as all the other people who have supported the podcast over the years. Thanks so much. This is the Mountain and Prairie Podcast. I'm Ed Robertson. Back in September of 2022, I held the first annual Strenuous Life Retreat at the renowned Zapata Ranch in Colorado's San Luis Valley. The retreat consisted of 5 days of adventure and education, inspired by Theodore Roosevelt's well-known commitment to living the strenuous life. We hiked high into the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, rode horses in Great Sand Dunes National Park, and enjoyed world-class meals every night. And each afternoon, we had facilitated conversations about land stewardship, conservation, and regenerative agriculture. This episode is a recording of one of those conversations. I was honored to be joined by conservation veteran Nancy Fishbein, who serves as Director of Resilient Lands for the Colorado chapter of the Nature Conservancy. Nancy has been a long-standing leader in the Western conservation community, so we were all honored that she took time out of her full schedule to join us and share some stories and hard-earned wisdom. The Zapata Ranch is owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by Ranchlands, so Nancy has a unique insight into the history of the ranch, as well as the importance of conservation in the San Luis Valley. We recorded this conversation at the ranch's education center one afternoon after a morning of horseback riding. The first half consists of me asking the questions, and the second half consists of questions from the retreat participants. We cover everything from the history of the Zapata Ranch to the establishment of Great Sand Dunes National Park, which adjoins the ranch to the north. We talk about the conservation bison herd that calls the ranch home, and some of the ongoing challenges in the San Luis Valley created by water speculation and development. We talk about how mineral rights development can coexist with conservation, the protection of biodiversity on ranches, how TNC and the National Park Service work together, and much more. As you'll hear, everyone in attendance was super engaged and curious about Nancy's work, and it showed in the range of interesting and thoughtful questions. I hope this episode will give you a bit of insight into the types of conversations we had at the 2022 retreat, and the kind of conversations you can expect in 2023 and beyond. Colorado is blessed to have so many committed conservationists like Nancy who devote their time and energy to protecting and stewarding these spectacular landscapes, and I can't thank Nancy enough for taking the time to join us. If you're interested in attending the 2023 retreat, as of this recording, there's still a few spots left. You can follow the link in the episode notes or go to ranchlands.com to learn more. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy.
It is quite a pleasure to have Nancy here. I mean, she's been doing this for a really long time and is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to conservation in the West in general. But then when where we're sitting in this building right now to zoom out the San Luis Valley to zoom out to southeastern Colorado, we couldn't have a better person here. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for adjusting it out a little bit with our crazy ride. Maybe first thing, could you just introduce yourself, maybe just give a quick bio of your background and how you ended up in your current position?
So my name is Nancy Fishbein, and my title is the Director of Resilient Lands at the Nature Conservancy's Colorado office, which is based in Boulder. But we operate all over the state. I've been with the Conservancy for 31 years, which is pretty much my entire adult career. I moved to Colorado from Washington, D.C., where I was doing a research fellowship with World Wildlife Fund, and was lucky enough to apply for and get a job in the Colorado field office of the Nature Conservancy based in Boulder, which I thought was pretty much my ideal job. And as evidence, I'm still here after 31 years, so it's been a pretty great ride. I came to conservation pretty much always. I've always been interested in nature and in being outdoors. That's certainly where I find my solace. Even when I was a little kid, I think it was that first Earth Day, 6th grade, when we got to clean up the local river in my town that I was absolutely hooked on doing something for the environment. It was just a really cool experience, and I thought to myself, I could do this. And it took me a while to get to the Conservancy, but once I was here, I really stayed.
You were telling me just before we hit record here about this building. So I was thinking the idea is we kind of zoom out. We'll start with Zapata Ranch and zoom out. But Nancy said there's a cool story about this particular building where we're sitting. So could you tell that, and then we'll start zooming out?
Sure. So I don't know if many of you know that this property was owned by a company, before the Nature Conservancy purchased it, it was owned by a company called Rocky Mountain Bison. And that company was originally a Japanese-owned company, and the theory behind their ownership of this property was they were going to turn it into a high-end golf resort, and bring Japanese tourists over to experience the western United States and also have a golfing experience. So when we purchased this property, there was an 18-hole golf course here, and you can still see remnants of the course if you walk around. There's a couple of places where there's a little area of up that were tees, and they now have benches on them, and so you get a nice vista, but they were the actual tees. And this was the pro shop. So we transferred it over into an education center now, but it was originally the pro shop, and there were carts out there, and you could buy all kinds of stuff. And it was a golf course that didn't get a lot of use for the local community. And when the Conservancy bought the property, we went through a whole process to decide whether or not we would try to keep it, whether we would try to sort of have a native golf course with native vegetation. But it ended up, it really wasn't aligned with the Nature Conservancy's mission. So we ended up closing the golf course, and it has gone back to its native vegetation now. But sort of an interesting tidbit.
Can you just talk a bit about how did this ranch come on the radar of TNC? Because back when I was selling ranches, the company I worked for, I remember we sold one to TNC, the J.E. Canyon Ranch. And, I know that TNC is well funded and you've got a lot of options all the time. So, how did this first come on your radar, and what attracted you to this over however other many ranches y'all could have bought?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I have to go back a little bit in the history of the Nature Conservancy involvement in the San Luis Valley. So the Nature Conservancy, for those of you that don't know, is really focused on the conservation of biological diversity. And now, certainly, the conservation of biological diversity includes the conservation of people. People are part of nature, and we work in communities all over the world to promote the conservation of nature for itself and for people as well. But our connection to the San Luis Valley came about in the 1980s. We did a conservation easement on the other side of the valley, called on the La Garita Ranch. And over time, we monitored and stewarded that conservation easement. We still do, so we always had somebody coming down to the valley to look at that property. And over the course of time, we got introduced to another property that's in the middle of the valley called Meshack Lakes, which is a wetlands, an ephemeral wetlands, which, if you've learned about this valley at all, the ephemeral wetlands in the San Luis Valley are critical to migrating water birds and wildlife. And because of the very deep aquifer and the aquifer that underlays the San Luis Valley, even though it's a very dry environment, these wetlands pop up all over the valley, either from artesian wells or just from water coming down from the mountains. Critically important. So we were introduced to Meshack Lakes by a wetlands biologist named David Cooper, and we purchased that property over time and sort of introduced ourselves and got more and more involved in the valley and realized how incredible the San Luis Valley is. It is a hotbed of diversity, not only biological diversity, but human diversity as well. It is a fascinating place. But there are a lot of rare species here. It's a critical flyway for a lot of migrating waterfowl and birds. So it became a place that we were interested in. And during our kind of assessment of the valley, we were approached by the landowner of this property, Rocky Mountain Bison, Isa Oda, who was the sole owner at that time, and he was very interested in conserving this property and reached out to the Nature Conservancy to see if we would be interested in acquiring it, because he was ready to sell. Really wanted to make sure that it would be conserved. So we jumped on that. We were very excited to partner with him. This is an incredible property. The fact that it has a connection to the sand dunes, it builds connectivity in this landscape. It also has some rare plants on it and rare animals, has a little tiger beetle that's very rare, but it's just an amazing property. So that's how we got involved in this property to begin with.
And I remember with Jay Canyon how the acquisition went, but like when you identified this place, did you have the funding in place to move, or was it you find it, get it under contract, and then go raise the money? How did you do it for this, and then is that generally how TNC does it?
Yeah, so TNC has to fundraise for any project that we do. We have to identify the funds, and we use a combination, in most cases, a combination of private philanthropy dollars that come in through donations with some sort of either foundation grant. In some cases, we use government funding, whether it's from Colorado Parks and Wildlife or federal funding in some cases as well, to put together the package to buy the property. We don't have the money just sort of sitting there waiting to be used, or didn't in this case. The Conservancy itself has sort of a revolving loan fund that each chapter of the Conservancy, we now call them business units, are able to tap into, but there are conditions connected with borrowing that money, even though it's an internal loan fund. So over the years, we've been creative about where we find those funding sources. In this case, the landowner made a very generous donation of value. So we did not pay full fair market value for this property. We also got a very sizable grant from Great Outdoors Colorado, which, for those of you that don't know, is a lottery-funded agency in Colorado that funds the acquisition of open space, including parks and recreational facilities, but there's also a lot of acquisition for nature, open space. So this was a combination of private funding sources, foundation money, as well as funding from Great Outdoors Colorado.
And not trying to promote Mountain Prairie over and over, but if you want to learn more about Great Outdoors Colorado, I had the former executive director on a few years ago in a partnership with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, where he goes through that whole program. But it's really interesting, and I'm going to try to get the new executive director on as well, because it's really a model, a national leader in conservation funding. So, wait, first of all, why did the landowner give you a deal? Because a lot of people try to act like they're giving deals, or they want to give deals, and then when the dollars and when you put it together, you realize who's just talking and who's not. I mean, that was very generous.
It was very generous. I don't know that I can speak to his motivation, but I think that he says first and foremost a conservationist, and he really wanted this property protected. And over the years, got to know our state director at the time and some of the staff, and he really connected with us. And I think that's so much part of doing conservation work, is establishing those kinds of personal relationships with the people that you're working with. Sometimes it happens really quickly, and sometimes it takes years. We have projects that we have worked on for decades where the landowner isn't ready, and then finally they're like, yeah, I like these guys. I'm willing and ready to work with them. And I think in this case, knowing that the property was going to be conserved forever by an organization like the Nature Conservancy really motivated him to make it happen for us.
Well, at dinner last night, Nancy and I were talking about the importance of relationships, and especially out in southeastern Colorado. I've done some stuff with TNC over the years, and I mean, TNC does great work globally, but we both were talking about how Nancy and several of the other team members at TNC, they've been out there the guy we were talking about is named Matt Moorhead, and he's been out there for 20 years building these relationships, one after another, with one rancher after another, and it pays off. I mean, when you look at the numbers of acres conserved, it's very inspiring to see. But it's funny that even such a powerful, massive organization like TNC, it still comes down to one relationship at a time, and you can't get out of that.
No, absolutely. And I think that is what makes the Nature Conservancy so effective, is that we are very collaborative, and we always work collaboratively. We always try to find common ground. And when you start off in a community, and I'll use Southeast Colorado as an example, there is a perceived disconnect between ranchers that make their living on the ground and they're a stereotype of conservationists. And it seems as though we are worlds apart. But when you sit down at the dining room table or the kitchen table over a cup of coffee, and you start talking about what it is that you have in common, you're not talking about what we want to do, and we want you to conserve your property. There's none of that in the initial conversations. It's really just about, what do you love about this land? What do you want to do with it? What do you want for your children or your grandchildren? What do you want your legacy to be? And then you try to figure out, is there a way for us to help you do that? Is there some common ground there? And you find that there are often more commonalities than there are differences, even though you think initially that we're going to be worlds apart. Oftentimes you're not. And I think that kind of collaborative spirit and that kind of relationship development is crucial to any kind of lasting conservation, no matter what landscape you're working in.
And I've worked with Matt on deals on the ground with ranchers, and then when I was at Palmer, we partnered with TNC on both funding and on projects. And I mean, I can speak from both sides, and it's the real deal. It's inspiring to see, and the results speak for themselves as well over a long period of time. All right, so you buy the ranch, close, it's yours. Then what? What do you start doing?
We own 100,000 acres of land. So this property was a combination of fee ownership, so where we owned the property, and lease land. There was a lot of lease land. Together it was about 100,000 acres. It's a very large state land board lease and about 30,000 acres of deeded land. So the first thing that we do in a situation like that is we figure out, how are we going to manage this property? What is it that we want to do out here? What do we want the property to be? And first and foremost, of course, we have to protect the conservation values for which we acquired the property in the first place. And none of the activities that can go on there can jeopardize the conservation of those values. So we send out our cadre of scientists to understand what is on the property that we're interested in protecting and catalog that and develop a management plan that goes along with those conservation values. The interesting thing about this property, of course, is that it was not just a vacant piece of land. A lot of our preserves are. This property had an incredible infrastructure on it. It had a lodge. It had historic buildings. It not only had this side of the property, but the other side of the property, where you went today, on the other side of Lane 6, which we call the Medno, there was a herd of 2,200 bison out there as well as the corrals and historic buildings that are in disrepair out there as well. So it was not a simple exercise in this case at all. And there were things about this property that were not necessarily aligned with the Nature Conservancy's mission. The golf course is what I spoke to before. And in a sense, the inn really wasn't either. And over the course of a couple of years, the Conservancy, we started out running the inn. We had our own staff down here. Our cook was on staff, our hospitality person. We had a facilities manager. We had a bison manager. And we realized after a couple of years that probably wasn't our forte, recognized that we probably should figure out how to partner with somebody that really did that and did that well. And that's how we came to partner with Ranchlands. They had the unique skill set of being able to manage a 2,200 head bison herd and also make incredible meals for guests in the lodge. So a unique combination of skills. So I'm not sure, did I answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And this may be a very basic question, but I'm not 100% sure. Early on, did you put an easement, a conservation easement on the whole place?
We did.
Can you explain conservation easement for people who may not?
Absolutely, sure. So a conservation easement is, very simply put, it is a legally binding document, I guess, that encumbers a property in perpetuity. And if you think of it, and this is the way it's often described, if you think of property ownership as a bundle of sticks, each one of those sticks represents something you can do on your property. You can subdivide it, you can cut the trees down, you can build a house, you can do all these different things. When you place a conservation easement on your property, you take some of those sticks and you give them to a conservation organization to hold for you and make sure that nobody ever uses those sticks again. And those sticks may be things like the right to develop or the right to subdivide your property or the right to manage it in a certain way, the right to mine. Those are things that you're giving up. And the specific tools or the specific sticks that you give up is a negotiation between you, the landowner, and the organization who's going to hold your conservation easement. So they vary depending on the property, depending on the conservation values you're trying to protect. In this case, the Nature Conservancy, you wouldn't think, why would we have to put a conservation easement on our property? That's our job, is to protect it. But there are certain funding sources that require a conservation easement to be placed on a property that they fund, and Great Outdoors Colorado is one of those organizations. So as part of a condition of providing funding for us, we had to place a conservation easement on the property, which we willingly did, because, of course, our goal is to protect the property and have it protected forever.
And the bison aspect, was that from the very beginning something that you guys knew you wanted to keep a active bison ranch, or was there ever consideration of, well, maybe we can lease it out to a cattle ranch? Or why were the bison such a long-term thing for TNC?
So bison, according to archaeologists and ecologists, bison are a native species to the San Luis Valley. So there used to be bison here, just as there used to be bison on the Great Plains. And tribes would come into the valley thousands of years ago, would come into the valley to hunt bison. There's some great stories about Spanish settlers coming in and trying to domesticate bison and getting into a lot of trouble, trying to round them up with their horses. So they've been here for a long time, or they were here for a long time before they disappeared. So having a bison herd, inheriting or purchasing a bison herd was pretty exciting. The Nature Conservancy does have several bison herds on our preserves in different places around the country. This is our largest herd, and this herd is managed, this is a little bit tricky to explain, but they're managed as a conservation herd rather than a livestock herd. So typically in nature, bison herds are approximately 50-50 male and female. They are not rounded up all the time. They're not inoculated. None of that stuff happens in nature. So we are managing, and ranchlands are managing this bison herd as close as we can to a natural conservation herd. The ratio in a typical livestock herd, there are many, many more female animals than male animals, but that's not socially how bison react in the wild. So we're trying to mimic sort of their wild structure rather than how they would be managed if they were being managed strictly as a livestock herd. And it's been interesting to manage them that way, for sure. The herd is also genetically as pure a bison herd as you can get. I don't know that if you know, but bison, there's a lot of cattle genetics in many bison. This herd is pretty pure, and we've worked over the last 20 years to improve those genetics so that it is as close to a historic bison herd as you can get.
And so 20 years, Colorado West real estate market just has been going like that. Why has TNC held on to this place for so long versus putting the easement on as protected in perpetuity and selling it, making a good profit, and then investing that in new projects? What has kept TNC wanting to own this place for as long as it has?
So that's a great question, and one that we do wrestle with because economics change and priorities change with an organization like the Conservancy over time. And the way we do business today is very different than the way we did business in 1951 when we started. So we're constantly evaluating and reevaluating our portfolio of preserves to understand sort of what's best, what's the best fit for the preserve. And this property, so one thing that's very unique about the Nature Conservancy as opposed to many other conservation organizations is that we do own land. And that really does set us apart. Even with all the other things that the Nature Conservancy does, when people learn that I work at the Nature Conservancy, they say, oh, we love you guys because you buy land. And then I have to explain all the other things we do. But that buying land part is so essential to our brand. And the reason we own land and the reason that we preserve it, I mean, first and foremost, we keep land, we preserve it because of its conservation values. And in a lot of instances, we are the organization that is best suited to manage that property and protect those conservation values. But we also use our preserves for other reasons. We use our preserves for things like this, where we bring people in to learn about the work that we do, not only here in the San Luis Valley, but all over the globe. And it's a platform through which we teach people about our work. It's also a place where we certainly bring donors out here as well, and our preserves help us raise essential funding for the rest of our work. The other thing about this property in particular is that it's almost like a little bit of a keystone piece in a much, much larger, connected, protected landscape. And if you look around, it is incredible. I mean, you can see this on the map of Colorado, this collection of protected land, all the way from the whole spine of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve, to the wilderness area, to the Baca Refuge, down to the Blanca wetlands area, all the way down to some of the private protected land that is along the spine of the Sangre de Cristos into New Mexico. It's an enormous assemblage of protected land, combination of federal land, privately protected land, and conservation easement on private lands. So it's really it's really interesting being in the middle of that large protected area. It's a unique position to be in.
Yeah, and some of you all may have read, it was years ago now, but south of here, as the Sangres continue to go, a lot of that mountain range is privately owned, and the finance hedge fund guy, Louis Bacon, he conserved his big ranch down there that was, 180,000 acres, something like that. And so there's a lot of really innovative stuff going on here. One other question about this ranch before we talk about San Luis Valley, and I'm gonna give a lot of time for questions from everybody as well. So you got National Park, I know BLM. There's just a lot of different agencies. Can you talk about what kinds of relationship management you have to do with all the different? Because I know you were here for some meetings yesterday. So how does that all play together, kind of constantly dealing with all the different federal agencies, or if there are state agencies still?
Yeah, another great question. I think the federal agencies do try to work together on joint management plans. They get together, they get their wetland scientists together to talk about wetlands, especially in a place like this where connectivity is so critical. And that's the same with us as well. So we have land now that is basically embedded within the boundaries of the national park and the Baca Wildlife Refuge. So we work very closely with our federal partners on our management and how we manage our bison herd. Our bison actually graze on their property. So we have to work very closely together. To just take it out a little bit more broadly even, the San Luis Valley is, as I was saying, an incredibly diverse place with a lot of different interests. And people in the valley come together when their resource is threatened and work together in a collaborative way that is really, it's hard to imagine in other places. It's an amazing model of community coordination and collaboration. So the whole management of this valley, from its water resources to its land base and its protected land, has been a collaborative effort and a community-based conservation project really across the whole valley. So we are constantly working in that fashion to make sure that what we do is jiving with what the federal government is doing on their lands and what private landowners are doing in the valley as well.
When you think about the San Luis Valley broadly, there's so many of these conservation victories, from conservation easements to innovative water work. Like friends at Colorado Open Lands are doing great things. But with all your experience, what is the number one worry when you think about this? Like, what is the thing that you're like, we got to figure this out? Because you're figuring out a lot. You've figured out a lot.
The San Luis Valley is what is one thing that is unique. I shouldn't say incredibly unique about the valley is its water resource. So it's a very dry place. It's really a desert environment. It gets very, very little precipitation most of the time. Yet there are incredible wetlands and water resources that underlie this valley. There's a huge aquifer underlying the San Luis Valley, and it is supplied by the snowfall and the moisture that comes from the mountains, the Sangre de Cristos on one side and the San Juans on the other side, that fill this bathtub full of water. It comes to the surface in the form of seeps and wetlands and artesian wells, and it supports an amazing diversity of natural life as well as a very robust and strong agricultural community. The population center in the San Luis Valley is small. The water resources are huge. And there's a huge population on the other side of the mountains that have no water and lots of people. So there is this constant threat to take water out of this valley and ship it over the mountains to service the Front Range. And as the population of the Front Range grows and water scarcity increases because of a warming climate, that threat to the water resources in this valley is going to grow continuously. And there was just recently yet another threat, another scheme to pull water out of the valley. So,
can you describe that real quick?
So the theory is that there'll be some pumping of the groundwater. So it's a very complicated water situation. You probably know about it. There's a confined aquifer. There's an unconfined aquifer that's separated by a clay layer.
Yeah, I fully understand.
Yeah, it's and depending on where you put your straw, you're either in the shallow aquifer or the confined aquifer. And this is a closed basin. You may have heard that term, the closed basin canal. The water comes in and it doesn't go out. It is not tributary to the Rio Grande. So any water that comes out of this valley is only replenished by the snowfall that comes down from the mountains. The only reason we get water from the Rio Grande is through the Closed Basin Canal, which is another convoluted water project that puts water into this closed basin and then takes it out again and delivers it back to the Rio Grande. So the schemes or the proposed projects in many of the cases have been to pump water out of the aquifer. Whether it's the confined aquifer or the unconfined aquifer, I don't know. Different in different cases. And basically take that water and ship it out. And the theory is that it wouldn't really have an impact on the valley because it's coming from a deep down in the aquifer, and that water is not coming to the surface. So therefore, it wouldn't have an impact on the surface. I think that has been debunked.
Yeah, that sounds like a very convenient theory. I'd like to meet the person that came up with that theory.
Yeah, but it keeps coming up, and I think it's because the pressure to find water for the Front Range is just so acute. And this just seems like a combination of a lot of water and a lot of people or a few people with not a lot of political clout. And that's a great combination if you're trying to develop a water scheme to take water out of the valley. But so far, the valley has proved very resilient in coming together and fighting those schemes. So,
well, for some context, where I live in Colorado Springs, I think it's 80% of our drinking water from Colorado Springs utilities comes from the Colorado River on the other side of the Continental Divide. So there's this big barn. If you've ever driven through Divide, Colorado, there's this really nice-looking barn up on the top of the divide. Like, yeah, it's a nice barn, and it's a pumping station. It's this massive pump that's pulling water, probably 100-some miles. And in my mind, it's not a question of if, it's when they turn that tap down. And it's going to get interesting. I want to pause for questions because I want this to be a time for you guys to engage. Yeah.
Nancy, you've been involved with this property for a long time, and you have the benefit at this point of that's just a lot of history here. Is there anything you wish you had done different in the whole negotiation of the acquisition or the placement of the easement on the property?
No, and I think it was a great project. We worked with a wonderful landowner who was excited to work with us. It was a very smooth negotiation, and there were no hostilities. No, not really. The conservation easements are pretty straightforward. We work with an organization that we may actually ask them they may be transferring the easement to a more local land trust at some point because that's not really their thing anymore. But at the time, it was a very smooth negotiation. It's one of the shining stars in our portfolio of projects that we've done over the years, and we've done many, many, many projects over my tenure. It's definitely one of the ones that I'm most proud of.
Follow-up question, if you don't mind. Is there anything you've learned about the property that you didn't know on the front end that has been a pleasant surprise in terms of its impact or relationship to the valley?
That's another good question. I think that it's one thing that the Conservancy is working a lot more on now that we didn't know when we first started here is the whole issue or the concept of connectivity and resilience. So in the face of a changing climate, we need to protect places that are going to be that can bounce back in the face of changing climate, that provide a resiliency to things that live here so that they can weather a hotter and drier climate, which is likely what we'll have in this part of the world. So forging these connections between this property and other properties is now critically important. This property itself has some resilience to it. It's pretty flat, so it doesn't have a lot of topographical variability, which is one of the keystones of resilience. But it does have incredible connection to a huge array of other private land, other protected land, including the mountains just to our east. So that ability for things to move from the flatlands up into the mountains as things get hotter and drier is essential. So this place in and of itself is important, but its connection to the surrounding area is even more important than itself as an individual property. And I think we've learned sort of how important it is in this larger landscape, much more than we knew when we initially purchased the property.
I have probably a very simplistic question because just my lack of knowledge. Why wouldn't an easement be put on the aquifer?
So today, conservation easements don't apply to water only.
I just didn't understand the logic of that, because to me that feels like the simple solution. We just make it where they can't come pump it out. Yeah.
Well, and the aquifer isn't owned by anybody.
Right.
So with a conservation easement, it's a private property right that a landowner gives away. Now, that conservation easement can have language about protecting water. So if a property has a water right on it, for example, that allows the landowner to irrigate, because you have to, in the West, you have to use your water right. You can't just let it go. You have to use it or you lose it. So the conservation easement can tie that water right to the land. So if the water right is essential to protect the conservation value, if you take the water right off, the conservation value will suffer. The easement can connect that water to the land, but it can't just protect a sort of a huge water resource if that water resource isn't specifically owned. And it can't yet just protect a water right. That is something that the conservation community and the water community is exploring. Conservation easements specifically for water rights, but we do not have that yet in Colorado.
And tonight, for anybody who wants to listen, I'm going to talk about the project that I was working on at Palmer, which is pretty much exclusively water irrigated farmland, and how that works. So we can dig into that.
So I was looking at the map of the ranch and the surrounding area, and I noticed how the sand dunes were originally a national preserve and monument, and then became a national park in 2000, and the Baca Ranch was thrown into the wild refuge, and then I think some of maybe the Zapata Ranch was put in the park. Was the Nature Conservancy involved in creating that refuge in the national park and all the complications that provided a greater, larger protected status around here?
We were. And I'm so glad you asked, so I can tell this great story. And I can give you the brief history of a very, very complicated project. So in 1999, when we purchased this property, we became kind of a landowner in the valley. We were approached by citizens of the valley who were interested in protecting the water resource that is on the Baca Ranch. The Baca Ranch was owned by a water development company called AWDI back in the 80s and 90s. And that was one of the first attempts to transport water out of the valley and to the Front Range. And over many years of litigation, that project was denied, went all the way up to the Colorado Supreme Court. So AWDI sold the Baca Ranch, which is a 100,000-acre Spanish land grant that was granted to the Baca family in the 1860s as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. They sold that property to another entity that also had the thought that they would try again to export water. So when that sale went through, the citizens of the valley were very concerned and were looking for a longer-term solution to protect the water and the water rights that were part of the Baca Ranch. So they approached the Nature Conservancy and asked us to be part of a coalition to help solve that problem. So in the ensuing couple of years, actually the ensuing year, which is a remarkable timeline, incredibly compressed timeline to create a national park, a bipartisan coalition of the Colorado delegation, which at that time was Senators Allard and Ben Nighthorse Campbell, one Democrat, one Republican, Congressman Scott McGinnis, a lot of the local politicians, as well as the Secretary of Interior, Bruce Babbitt, and the Attorney General, Ken Salazar, who is a San Luis Valley native, or local, all came together in this great summit, and they walked out on the sand dunes and they said, we are going to make this a national park. And because of that enthusiasm and the local support, they asked the Nature Conservancy to help them purchase the Baca Ranch. So in 2000, the Great Sand Dunes National Park and Preserve Act was passed and signed, and one of the conditions for the creation of the national park was the acquisition of the Baca and the transfer of that property into federal ownership. Now, the acquisition of land for federal ownership is not the most popular thing in the world in the West. But in this case, it was incredibly popular, very incredible support from all over the valley. It was one of those instances where all the disparate interests in the valley came together to support this project. So over the next 4 years, the Nature Conservancy negotiated for the acquisition of that 100,000-acre ranch and eventually transferred it to the federal government for inclusion in the national park and the preserve and the creation of the Baca National Wildlife Refuge. So that happened in 2004, and we had a big dedication ceremony out here, and the administration had changed in 2000. So we dealt then now with a new president, a new Secretary of the Interior, but all equally supportive of this project and of getting the park, preserve, and refuge dedicated. So it's really exciting project, yeah. And just one last thought, because now with the expanded boundaries of the park now had boundaries that went further than it did when it was only a monument. Now the Nature Conservancy's lands on that side of the road are in holdings within the park and the refuge. So it is our plan to transfer those properties to the park and the refuge so that they can be managed as part of those federal entities. And that was always our thought all along. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, great. What is the distinction between national park and national monument? Is it a who's in charge situation? Is it a funding? What's the distinction? And it might not be the purview as you're kind of more private.
So they're both within the National Park Service. So the National Park oversees monuments and the park. There are different things that can happen within the park and a monument. There may be different funding involved. There's certainly a cachet about being a national park that monuments don't have. And one of the reasons I think that the citizens were so excited about the park, in addition to its ability to protect the water, was having a national park in the San Luis Valley. That's a pretty cool thing. So,
unrelated question. So you had mentioned initially, I guess during the Rocky Mountain Bison Company timeframe, a great portion of this was leased land from the state of Colorado. Is that correct? When you guys collectively purchased it, do you consume those lease rights? Does the state relinquish those if they go into conservation easement, or do they kind of go on in perpetuity?
So the state lease transferred to the Nature Conservancy when we bought the property. So we became the lessee on those state lands. Subsequent to that, the state land board decided to divest of the portion of the property that they owned on this side of the road. They sold that to we bought that from the state land board. And the land that they owned on the other side of the road was part of a complicated land exchange where the state land board acquired lands in other places and transferred that property to the federal government.
So is it safe to assume that if there wasn't that pressure from that entity to supply water to the Front Range, that there would never be a national park here in the San Luis Valley? Or I just think it's ironic that what their actions ended up doing was creating a great national park. I don't know what your thoughts on that are, but or if there would have been one eventually, if there was calls for that.
It's hard to say. I mean, certainly the funding came together for the federal government to acquire that piece of property because of this existential threat. The Baca Ranch itself, though, was an incredible property, and it did have active sand dunes on it. So it made sense that it become part of the sand dune complex and part of the ability for the park to manage and save its sand dune resource. So it may have happened anyway, but the fact that it happened in that time frame is just unbelievable. That from nothing to a national park in 4 years is really quite incredible. And really it happened in a year. Not the designation, but the act at least happened in a year. So just a remarkable time frame, which shows what can happen when we have bipartisan efforts, right?
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that was going to be my question. I mean, that's fairly long ago now. You're talking about Bruce Babbitt, and today we don't, in our political environment today, people don't listen to anything the other side says, and I don't know whether that's a thing of the past now.
Well, I hope not. We definitely have some many issues that require all of us to put on our thinking caps and work together. Certainly climate is a huge one. We need to find solutions that work for everybody, and we can't do that if we don't talk to each other. So And that's why I work for the Nature Conservancy. This is what we do. This is the way we operate. We don't tend to stick our stick in the sand and challenge people. We really try to figure out ways forward. And I would hope that our leaders can do the same.
So I've got another question that's maybe a bigger picture, zoom out, as Ed called it, about Nature Conservancy. So, hearing, seeing what's been done here, it's a very pro-agriculture, very ag-centric program that wouldn't be possible without the Nature Conservancy. Ed's podcast has talked about a lot, have I say maybe opened my eyes a lot to the good work that the Nature Conservancy is doing to benefit agriculture. And then, but you hear this, maybe over the years, especially in I come from Texas, which is a private property state, and from the folks in the West that would just charitably call them private property enthusiasts, the Nature Conservancy is used as one of those slurs of like people that are trying to come take land and steal it out of agriculture and that sort of thing, which is clearly not the case of what's happening right here in this valley. Over the years, has the Nature Conservancy taken on a more ag-centric focus as they've learned you've seen the scientific benefits of agriculture towards conservation and environmental improvement, or has that always been there and it's just not been as well told as it's being told now? Or just I would love to know more about that, because it's a really cool story that more folks need to know about in agriculture.
Yeah, I can answer that in a couple of different ways. I do think that when the Nature Conservancy first started many, many, many years ago, 70-something years ago, we bought land and put fences around it and said, we have a preserve and we're going to protect the rare plant that is found there and nowhere else in the world, and check, done. And as you come to realize that there are impacts outside of your little fence line that are going to impact what happens inside your little fence line, that you have to take a more broad perspective on the work you do and how you're doing your conservation work. So that evolution has certainly come even since I've worked at the Conservancy. But when you look at private land ownership in the United States and you look at where lands are threatened, most of the private property in the West, large chunks of land that are in, say, our grasslands habitat, which is the most threatened habitat in the world and the least protected, those are ranchers that own that land, right? I mean, they have owned and stewarded that land for generations. So if you want to protect that land, you need to work with those people. I mean, you need to understand what they're doing on their land, and you need to work with them to figure out whether what they're doing is great and encourage the continuation of that, or whether there's ways to work together to tweak management as we learn about different management strategies that may be more beneficial, not only for the ecology, but also for the economics of the rancher, him or herself. So I think there's a recognition that if we're going to work and protect private lands, we have to work with private landowners. And you can't, private landowners need to make a living off their land. So you have to figure out how you make that living in a way that is sustainable. Sustainable agriculture is a term that you probably hear all the time. And it's really true. I mean, ranchers in particular will tell you that they are conservationists. If they didn't conserve their grass resource, they would have nothing. So they have to operate their ranches in a way that is sustainable, and we would like to help them do that as best we can. There are other places where there are incentives to convert land from native grasslands to row crop agriculture. So the Conservancy also we work on the ground, but we also work kind of at the policy level to try to encourage a smart set of policies to discourage that kind of conversion of native prairie or native habitat, and improve farming and ranching practices to better manage land. So we're definitely, there's a partnership with the agricultural community for sure that the Conservancy has developed over the years. I'm really proud of what we've done in Colorado. We have a wonderful relationship with the Colorado Cattlemen's Association now that was sort of unheard of 30 years ago. We're really proud of that, and I think they have learned a lot from us, and we have learned a tremendous amount from them as well.
So in that vein, does the Nature Conservancy consider agricultural easements as an option for preserving or helping to manage those properties? So say, for instance, the bison you weren't able to designate them as a resource, and they were an agricultural entity, but still important to the ecosystem, would that make sense to also have an agricultural easement?
So I'm not sure what you mean by an agricultural easement. Do you mean an easement over agricultural land? Is that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So where I live in California, we have agricultural easements that designate that as agricultural land. Most of them are family ranches, so they preserve them as agricultural land.
So I'm not sure that this specifically we're doing that here, but we do. Most of the land on which we hold conservation easements is working land. We tend not to do that much conservation work on farmed ground because that's not the Conservancy's main mission. And there are other organizations like American Farmland Trust, for example, that is a great organization to protect farm ground. We tend to work on land that is rich in biodiversity, and that is typically more native grasslands or native habitats, ecosystems. But that's not to say that our conservation easements don't help keep land in agriculture by providing funding, in many cases, for landowners and removing from the property through the tool of a conservation easement a lot of the uses that would turn that property from an agricultural property into something else.
And you mentioned that there's no control over water rights, definitely in terms of the basin, etc. Is there any control with an easement over mineral rights and other entities that can be extracted from, laterally? Is that able to be controlled?
Yeah, so a conservation easement, in order to qualify really as being a conservation easement, it must preclude mineral through surface disturbance. So if a landowner doesn't control the minerals underneath the property, which is common in the West, the mineral rights and the surface rights are often severed, we have to determine that the likelihood of developing those minerals from a surface method is remote. Otherwise, we won't do an easement on the property. The other form of mineral development, however, is oil and gas development, and that can be done without surface disturbance or with minimal surface disturbance. So what do you do in that case? The conservation easement cannot preclude the development by a third party that's not a party to the minerals. So if a landowner owns the minerals, that's easy. But if a third party owns the minerals, we have to figure out whether the likelihood of that mineral development is, whether it's likely or not, how likely it is, and then whether it can be done in a way that has a minimal impact. And with oil and gas development, if it comes in from the side, if maybe there's one well on 10,000 acres, then the easement can still be valid and can still sort of control what happens. But we will not likely do a conservation easement on a property where we can't know with some certainty that it's not going to be mined, either with extensive oil and gas well pads that blanket the property. We can't. That conservation easement would not be really valid in our perspective. So while the easement itself can and must protect the surface from mineral development, when their third party is involved, it's complicated. If that makes any sense.
I don't want to go down a hole, literally or figuratively here, but it's like when you're talking about oil and gas, is there a difference in fracking development from more traditional just drilling?
I am not an expert in oil and gas development or fracking, so I don't know whether the fracking technique requires a bigger footprint on the surface than otherwise would. There are all kinds of other issues with fracking, certainly what you do with the water.
Yeah, it pollutes water and the groundwater, and sometimes it creates sinkholes, sometimes it creates earthquakes. Yeah. We got a lot of that in Ohio, eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania.
Yeah, and conservation easements are not necessarily the tool to address oil and gas development. It's not necessarily a tool that can stop it. nor necessarily should it. I do think that there are certainly other entities that are trying to figure out how to deal with oil and gas development and its impacts. And I would add, not only oil and gas development, but there are now becoming more and more impacts from renewable energy development and siting. And the Conservancy is involved with helping to steer the siting of renewables, which are a good thing when you look at climate change, but steer those things in places that where they will have the least impact on the biodiversity values that we're also trying to protect.
My most recent podcast came out last week was with the guys talking about golden eagle conservation, and they talk in there a little bit about how they're partnering with some of like wind developers to mitigate eagles that slam they've come up with really win-win solutions that are making a difference, that they started in the West that have exported out into other parts of the country. So it's cool that you hear all this bad news all the time and everybody's fighting, but there are a lot of people that are trying to find solutions to this problem. Sorry, I cut you off.
No, you didn't. In terms of your accountability to your the goals of purchasing, you talked about scientists and stuff like that. How do you judge yourself on success and keeping the biodiversity that you've set forth when you first purchased?
That's a great question. I think that measuring success is a growing field almost, coming up with metrics to measure a whole bunch of things: biodiversity conservation, carbon emissions. Just are we making a difference? And it is coming up with those metrics is really tricky, honestly. We, from a very small perspective, looking at a preserve level, we have to monitor our preserves and our conservation easements every year. And during those monitoring visits, we document the condition of the property as it relates to its initial condition at purchase. And we keep excellent records so we can see progressions over time. We can see impacts to the rangeland. That helps us adjust our management strategies, or if things are very dry, or if things are particularly wet, which doesn't happen very often anymore. So there's a constant checking in to see if we're doing the right thing by the land that we've protected. So we hold ourselves accountable that way with this annual monitoring. If you start looking at the larger picture of getting to our goals, to our strategic goals of protecting X amount of land or X amount of biodiversity or helping X number of people, which is one of the Global Nature Conservancy's goals for 2030, is to help, I think it's 100 million people who are living in places that are susceptible to climate change. So how do you measure that? I mean, we have a whole team, it's hard to imagine, a whole team of scientists that worry about those metrics, and that sort of rolls down to the business units and helping us jump onto that bandwagon and figure out how our success stories are going to roll up to our global initiatives, because we are all one organization, even though we have independent business units that work in individual states and countries. We all roll up to the Grand Nature Conservancy global organization, and keeping track and measuring our successes is a critical part of our work. I don't know enough about the metrics to give you details on how we measure those things, but it's a great question and a really valid one.
So in terms of that, how reactive, once you've collected data, are you in terms of changing management style? Or because in my 30-acre tract, there are some years that something disappears, but it reemerges without any influence on my part 2-3 years later, because the climate was more, it was just more accountable, or not accountable, but more amenable to that plant species or whatever coming back or whatever. But so what kind of response does your data create, and how quickly is that response?
So I think it's certainly on a case-by-case basis. I would say that most of the places that we have preserved, we call these preserves, are places that we own, are not protected for one thing. They're protected for a variety of species and habitats. I think the danger of protecting something for one thing is if that one thing disappears, then what do you have? So when we're looking at at measures of success and management changes, we're looking at a broader ecosystem. So the impacts are less severe on a year-to-year basis. We're looking more at trends over time, and then management adjusts as you notice those trends over time. And it may be, I'm trying to think of what a management shift might be. I mean, certainly on an agricultural property, the management shift is your stocking rate. If you have very dry conditions, you have to reduce your stocking rate, or you have to change your management strategy so you're not overgrazing. There may be. I'm sort of making this up, but in a preserve where we have a lot of public use, it may be that we've noticed that there's an influx of invasive species, or the trails, there's a lot of social trails that are going all over the place, that we have to come in and we have to address that and deal with that. And that happens on a fairly regular basis. It's very labor intensive to own land, and it's expensive to own land. So we really acquire property rarely. And when we do, we really have to be committed to invest in taking care of it. It's really important that we take care of it well. So that's. Did that address your question?
Got time for one more, I think.
As a fellow Coloradan, thank you for what you've done and the legacy you've left thus far. Is there anything on TNC's horizon in Colorado that's the, I won't say the crown jewel, but something you guys are really stretching for right now that we would be best served to know about?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about we have a new initiative called our Southern High Plains Initiative, and it is a project that started in southeast Colorado, sort of in the Trinidad area. We did the property that you mentioned, the J.E. Canyon property, which is just incredible red rock canyon country in the middle of the plains. You'd never expect it there. Beautiful.
Bighorn sheep running around. It's wild.
Crazy. Purgatory River. Yeah. And as we started working there, and this is a landscape that Ed alluded to, my colleague Matt Moorhead has been there for 20 years, working slowly to build a camaraderie and a collaboration down there. We realized that this landscape, this ecosystem that we're trying to protect, the shortgrass prairie, doesn't stop at the Colorado state line. Imagine that. It goes into our neighboring adjacent 4 states. So we got together with our colleagues in the Texas Panhandle, northern New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Kansas to build this Southern High Plains Initiative that covers about 71 million acres. The vast majority of it is private land, to try to work on building a resilient and connected network of land that, again, allows species to move in the face of climate change. Again, grasslands, our most threatened ecosystem, are least protected. I think 3% of the 70 million acres is protected right now. We recognize that protection means different things in different states. We have different constituencies in these states. We're working with different partners. So we're focusing on sort of 2 aspects of protection. Actual land protection, working with private landowners on conservation easements. We're doing things that we call our purchase, protect, and resell, which is where the Nature Conservancy will come in and buy a piece of property, put some protection on it, work for maybe a year or 2 on management, and then sell it to a conservation-minded buyer. And then we're also working in many of the adjacent states on improved management, particularly in Kansas and Oklahoma right now, but I think probably in all the states this will be effective, is really working with a community of landowners to think about how land potentially could be managed more sustainably. One project that we're working on now is using virtual fence with livestock, which is a really interesting technology. It's almost like a radio collar that you put on your puppies to keep them where you want them, but it's so sophisticated that you can tell your cattle where to go on your iPhone, or on, maybe it's not just an iPhone, but on your phone, your smartphone, and manage them without actually putting fences up, which is a really incredible technology. I think there's some kinks to work out on it, but I'm really excited about that project. It is, if you're interested in it, please go to nature.org and put in Southern High Plains Initiative, and it'll pop up, and you can get lots of information about it. It's really, really wonderful to work across state lines with our colleagues in other states. We just had a Colorado board meeting down in Trinidad where the boards and the staff from those 5 states all came together to learn about this initiative and walk some of the properties that we're working on. And it was really inspirational. In all my years at the Conservancy, I have never been to a board meeting like that. It was so exciting just to see the kind of enthusiasm for this this cross-border type work. And it's really the future. I mean, we really have to work that way. So thanks for the question.
So inspiring. I mean, we really did. We started in this room and then zoomed out to 5 Western states. So that was awesome. Nancy, thank you so much. I know your time is valuable and it's everything. And the fact you came down here to hang with us is awesome. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, it's Ed again. Thanks so much for listening to the podcast. I know your time is valuable, so it means the world that you spend it listening. If you want to support the podcast and help it to continue to spread and grow, there are a few ways you can help. Number 1, pass it along to a friend or share it on social media. Word of mouth recommendations are the most powerful way for ideas to spread, so I'd love it if you could share the podcast with a few pals who might enjoy it. Number 2, you can go to Apple Podcasts and give it a 5-star review. Good reviews encourage the Apple overlords to suggest the podcast to others. So there's a link in the notes if you'd be so kind as to give it 5 stars. Number 3, you can support the podcast financially via Patreon, and there are exclusive benefits for those who do, including a monthly behind-the-scenes newsletter, Mountain and Prairie stickers, live and recorded video chats with podcast guests, and much more. Number 4, I've also got 2 emails that I send out. The first is my weekly email called Good News from the American West, which I send out every Wednesday. It's only positive news, something we can all use a little more of these days. And my other email is my bi-monthly book recommendations email. 1 email every other month with 5, 6, 7, or 8 books that I've recently read and highly recommend. But thousands of people on both of these lists will vouch for me. No spam or other funny business. And number 5, finally, check out my online store for Mountain and Prairie stickers, shirts, and coffee mugs. I've got some really cool designs from Western artists with more on the way. So head to mountainandprairie.com/shop to check it all out. I'd love to connect with you. I'm on Instagram and LinkedIn, so look me up on either of those platforms by my name or through the links on my website. All right, that's it. Thanks so much for your support.